Welcome to part 4 in our Vendor 1099 reporting series, the final part to this series. We reviewed 1099 form box setup, Vendor 1099 list edits, Vendor 1099 list additions, and now we'll be reviewing how to print the 1099 forms to send to the vendor and generate the 1099 IRS file. Please note that we'll be using the 1099 reporting activity, which can be found in Finance, Processes, Tax Reporting, 1099 Reporting. This activity is permission-based and only assigned to higher-level users. If you do not see this activity, please contact support@schoolAbility.com for assistance and include Finance 1099 in the subject. Before we print our actual vendor 1099 forms, we'll want to do a final review of the vendor information. We're able to do this from the vendor 1099 list, as well as looking at the vendor 1099 detail report, Rec Pay 16, both of which we've seen in previous parts of this series. Today we'll see the vendor 1099 summary report, or the Rec Pay 07. With our vendor information reviewed, we'll open the 1099 reporting activity and then open the calendar year that we're working. We'll begin by reviewing the organization section in this form. The close and closed fields indicate if the calendar year was closed and when. Process is the number of vendors we had on our 1099 list. Paid is the number of those vendors who will receive a 1099. Problems indicates if there are any remaining problems on the vendor 1099 list. If so, the vendors with problems will not have a 1099 form printed. Printed are the number of 1099 forms we've already printed, and then we have the number of forms still waiting to be printed, and we'll see an example of that later. The printed and to print should add up to the number of paid vendors. The import file works the same here as it does on the vendor 1099 list. It's just a second location to be able to do that. The loaded column indicates the last time changes were loaded into the vendor 1099 list, updating the calendar year tax table in the database. You'll also see that in the top section for statistics, the same fields exist. This is for customers who print 1099 forms and file the IRS files for multiple organizations. This section would show the aggregate of those totals. Next up is reviewing our snapshots. The 1099 vendor forms prints the actual 1099 form that you will be sending to your vendors. The 1099 vendor log runs the Rec Pay 07 report, which is the vendor 1099 summary, and we'll run that report quickly since we haven't seen it yet. This report shows us the vendor ID, tax ID, vendor name, system amounts, import amounts, adjustment amounts, and the total 1099 amount. The report does include vendors who will not receive 1099 forms. You can run the report from Finance, Reports, Rec Payment if you'd like to filter out the vendors who will not be reported. In addition, you see the total returns for the organization by box number and then a breakout by state of the box number amounts. The remaining two snapshot options are for the Rec Pay 16 report, which we saw in part 1 of the series. It can be run sorted by name or sorted by status. The 1099 reporting activity also includes a history tab where you can see what changes have been made and by who. You'll see that I've made many changes in the recording of these tutorials. The history tab is also available on the vendor 1099 list for each individual vendor. Next, we're going to click on our snapshot 1099 vendor forms so that we can print the actual forms we'll be sending to our vendors. The report does not have snapshot as we saw in the vendor 1099 list copy, And it does print the full Social Security number if that is the vendor's tax ID. The schoolAbility software prints the entire form, including the boxes and form information. The forms that you'll need to order are blank, perforated, 3-up, 1099 miscellaneous forms that include the instructions on the back. You can order these from Office Depot, or you can do a Google search. Printing the vendor 1099 forms updates the number of printed forms on the 1099 reporting form, changes the vendor 1099 records from needed to printed status, and now forms must be unprinted if changes are needed. There are some reasons that you may need to unprint the 1099 forms. The 1099 amount may have been incorrect for a vendor. A vendor may not have received a 1099 form when they should have, or a vendor did receive a 1099 form and shouldn't have, or there may be a paper jam or someone loaded the wrong paper into the printer. For this last example, you'd want to use the Unprint All task to unprint all 1099 forms. But for the others, we're going to look at the vendor 1099 list again and making the individual changes there. For tutorial purposes, I'm going to change one vendor who's already been printed. I use the Quick Start V1, or I could have gone to Finance Processes, Tax Reporting, Vendor 1099 to get to the activity, change my calendar year to 2017, and when my list opens, I'm going to go ahead and collapse my activity tree so that I can see more columns on my screen. My next step is to sort the vendor name by descending. And you can see that the status has changed from needed to printed for many of the vendors. A 1099 has been printed for Travers Mechanical Services. The amount imported was overstated, and so I need to unprint this form and make the correction. I'll start by using the task Unprint. This is going to change the status from printed back to needed and allow me to edit. I'll open the form again and this time use the task to edit, which will unlock all of the adjustment amount fields. I enter the negative amount that needs to be reduced on this vendor 1099 and put in my adjustment reason. The check was included twice in the totals. My vendor is now ready to be printed. I can see that I have an adjustment amount and the status is set as needed. These same steps will need to be followed for any vendors on the list who need to be corrected. This includes vendors with a status of turned off or under the minimum dollar amount. This is because when we printed the 1099 forms, all vendors on the list got marked as printed. We can also add a new vendor as we did in part 3 of the series by clicking on the new button. We can use the task to import data, but it's important to note that any vendors on this list who have imported amounts cannot be changed through the import process unless the 1099 form is unprinted first. Importing a file will update the list with new vendors, but it will not change those already on the list unless they've been unprinted. After this, we go back to our search and rebuild our list to pick up the changes that we just made. Now we'll return to the 1099 reporting activity and open the calendar year. The organization's column for printed and to print has updated so that there are 23 printed and 1 left to be printed. We use the 1099 vendor form button to print the 1099 for that one vendor. Once it's printed, we close and reopen the activity. And now we're finally ready to generate our 1099 IRS file. This is done by using the task Generate. When we generate the 1099 file, there are several things that occur. The generated field on the form gets updated with who generated the file and when. In addition, the close and closed fields update to indicate that no more changes can be made for this calendar year. The 1099 IRS file was generated and stored in the Input-Output folder. If you're not familiar with this folder, please contact us at support@schoolAbility.com so that we can assist you further. The last thing that happens is the RecPay 16 is run and stored in the report warehouse automatically. Once the file is generated, no more changes can be made and the forms cannot be unprinted. So what happens if you discover that you do need to make an additional change before you send the file to the IRS? Well, this can be done by opening the 1099 reporting activity and using the task to roll back generate. Using this task will delete the existing file from the Input-Output folder, removes the generated info from the 1099 reporting activity, and now we can reopen the form and use the task to roll back close all. From here, we can unprint all 1099s, or we can go back to our vendor 1099 list and start the steps that we did earlier to make individual edits. Once those are done, once again, we would follow the steps to generate a new file. Once the file is sent to the IRS, you should not roll back generate. At that point, please contact schoolAbility for additional assistance. This concludes part 4 in our Vendor 1099 reporting series. As always, we welcome your comments, questions, and feedback at support@schoolAbility.com.